So there's plenty of food. Please continue to help yourself and help yourself to lunch. We're going to get started with our keynote speaker for today's afternoon. I'm going to ask my colleague Trig to come up and introduce himself and our speaker.
Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody, for being here. It is my pleasure not only to be here for this entire conference and to have learned from several of you, but it's really my pleasure and privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker, Harry C. Boyte, a renowned scholar, activist, and champion of democracy, and perhaps more notoriously, a dear friend and frequent co-author and collaborator of mine. Harry Boyte is co-founder of and senior scholar for public work philosophy at the Institute for Public Life and Work, based in St. Paul, Minnesota, which he founded with me, along with his wife, an international democracy educator of great renown, Mari Strom, who is with us here. His lifelong commitment to civic engagement and democracy has shaped his remarkable career spanning over 5 decades. Before I get into that, I want to ask everybody here just to imagine themselves as a young person of 18 on a sleeping bag, or in a sleeping bag on the floor of the Willard Hotel, listening to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. practice his I Have a Dream speech the night before the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Try to imagine what that would be like. And if it is hurting your brain, I have an easier solution, which is to ask Harry what it was like, because Harry was in that sleeping bag on that evening. His journey, I think as he would tell it, began in the 1960s when he served as a field secretary for Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This experience profoundly introduced his path and I hear tell changed him from an aspiring astrophysicist to a life of social and political activism. Throughout his career, Boyte has made significant contributions to our understanding of democracy and citizenship. He founded the International Youth Civic Education Initiative called Public Achievement, which puts students in the role of identifiers and creative solvers of problems that are important to them and to their communities, and teaches educators how to be coaches and facilitators of the creative, productive work of young people. It has spread to educational institutions across the world, Ireland and in East Asia, as well as several states and districts all across the United States. Harry established the Center for Democracy and Citizenship at the University of Minnesota, which is now part of the Sabo Center at Augsburg University in Minneapolis. Around the same time, beginning in 1993, he coordinated the Reinventing Citizenship Initiative, a cross-partisan effort working with President Bill Clinton's White House Domestic Policy Council to try to bridge the citizen-government divide. This is a really radical move at a time when others in the Clinton administration were releasing reports encouraging us to view political life as a business enterprise and to treat public service as a form of management. Harry's scholarly work is equally impressive. He's authored or co-authored, I think it's 11 books, but there may be more that I'm unaware of, on democracy, citizenship, and community organizing. His articles have appeared in over 150 publications, not just academic journals, but the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. He was also a co-founder, along with the Nobel laureate economist Elinor Ostrom, among others, of the transdisciplinary field of Civic Studies, a community of inquiry focused on theorizing, testing, and promoting citizen-centered, citizen-empowering modes of political life that transcend the traditional liberal, conservative, radical, and authoritarian categories that constrained political imaginations for most of the 19th and 20th centuries. At the core of all of this work, in my estimation, is Boyte's concept of public work, a philosophy that views democracy as built by the work of the people, not handed to them by government. Perhaps nobody speaks and writes so eloquently as Harry on the need for citizens to move from a consumer or a spectator mentality to a productive, co-creative mindset focused on building and sustaining a commonwealth, a central theme of his talk today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming not only a true visionary, but a tireless laborer in the fields of democracy and civic engagement, Harry C. Boyte.
Yeah, there we go. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today. It's an honor, impressive partners and stories, and I want to thank David Roof for his invitation. I'm especially glad to be here after surviving a heart attack a little over a month ago in Johannesburg, South Africa. We got back, Mari and I, on Wednesday. And so that's the reason I agreed with Dr. Rabowski yesterday about the importance of getting up beyond the lectern, but that's the reason I'm sitting down. I was thinking, it's interesting that Dr. Roof chose two old guys who were veterans of the civil rights movement to give talks, this symposium. I thought was it a coincidence? And then I thought, no. In my experience, the civil rights movement and broadly the freedom movement, as we call it on the ground, has been the leading force for democracy in American history, certainly in the 20th century. And I'll talk about that today. I want to begin with the culture of individual achievement, which Freeman Hrabowski fostered so brilliantly at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, has an important civic dimension. We talked a bit about that last night. I asked him to talk about the student-led efforts to change student government, to think about their role differently, to think about themselves as co-creators, to develop a culture of empowerment. I call this a commonwealth consciousness, and today I'll talk about bringing that back from American history as a profound resource for addressing the challenges we face in higher education and beyond. But in the spirit of Freeman last night, let me start with Langston Hughes' great poem, Let America Be America Again. How many people have heard of that poem? Well, you know it. He writes, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where everyone is free." This is a challenge for all of us to think of ourselves, in the words of Vincent Harding, a great leader in the movement, great friend of King who built on it. We are all citizens of a nation that does not yet exist, but has to exist. So it's a challenge to us all. As Freeman and I discussed at the end of his talk, great talk last night, UMBC not only prepared the highest number of black STEM PhDs in the country, the university has been a remarkable leader in student empowerment for public purpose. And he talks about that in chapter 10 of his book, The Empowered University. It aims at a land where every person is free. Freeman gave an account of his experiences as a young black boy who decided to join the marches in Birmingham. In those days, from jail, Martin Luther King was writing his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. How many have read that or seen that? Yeah, it's good. Great source for it, teaching and learning. King writes, "I hope the church," he talks about the role of the church, "as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour." And this, remember, was at the same time that Freeman was marching as a young 12-year-old. "Even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no fear about the outcome of our struggle for freedom. The very heart of America is the search for freedom. One day the South will know that when these disinherited children of God sit down at lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for what is best in the American dream and for the most sacred values in our heritage, bringing the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy from the founding moment. Now, those were ideals. They weren't realities. They were realities for some, but not for others. But they continued to be an inspiration from the movement that I saw all the time working with maids and janitors and sharecroppers and teachers across the South. We would read the preamble to the Declaration and the words of the Constitution, the preamble. So I thought I should tell my own story a bit. Trig previewed that a bit, but some of you may have heard of Bayard Rustin. How many people have heard of Bayard Rustin? Well, if you haven't, let me tell you, you should look at the new movie called Rustin on Netflix. It was produced by the Obama's production company to let people know about this great figure of the movement who was largely unknown. The reason he is unknown is because he was gay. He was kept out of sight. But he was also the organizer of the March on Washington. And in the promotion for the film, Obama says it's not only about Rustin, it's about the thousands of ordinary folks from all walks of life who showed the world what America could look like. It also highlights a little-known aspect of the march, which is the citizenship of the movement, the spirit of what Melvin Rogers, the political theorist, black theorist, calls aspirational citizenship. Not citizenship as it is in legalistic terms, but citizenship as what it can be in a dynamic understanding of democracy as a work in progress. The marchers, as Craig said, I heard King practice I Have a Dream. My dad had been a manager of the Red Cross and had been involved in school desegregation, and then Dr. King asked him to come on staff of the SCLC. First white in the SCLC, by the way. But he'd always been really passionate about racial justice. So I heard King practice that, and it was an inspiring speech to hear in practice the next day. But I want to say that as inspiring as the speech were the marchers. They had a spirit, a dignity, a discipline I'd never seen before. A kind of demeanor of significance and somebodiness that the whole movement cultivated. The program notes on the March on Washington are something to be seen. And David, I think what I'll do is send you the program notes to put on your list. They're really interesting and inspiring, and a window into history that we do not know very well. The program notes convey the nature of the marchers. The Washington March is a living petition of scores of thousands of both races. It will be orderly, get this language, it will be orderly but not subservient. It will be proud but not arrogant. It will be nonviolent but not timid. We don't have much of that anymore. The marchers demonstrated the difference between what in political theory is called mobs and publics. The British philosopher Margaret Canavan describes publics as having an exceptional degree of political realism and common sense, together with a remarkable capacity to exercise self-restraint and put shared long-term interests above private interests and short-term impulses. That's the discipline of citizens who become a public. And the program notes said it in one of the passages. They said, in a neighborhood dispute there may be stunts, rough words, and hot insults. But when a whole people speaks to the government, the quality of the action and the dialogue needs to reflect the worth of the people and the responsibility of the government. That was a call for a kind of publicness and a kind of citizenship that we urgently need. I have discovered through my research and talking to many people in the movement that that kind of citizen sobriety was years in the making. It grew from a little-known source of citizenship. People know about the black churches and sororities and so forth, and HBCUs to some extent. The story of a crucial dimension of that sobriety formation is largely unknown. So maybe I'll put a piece or two up about that. This is a story of thousands of Rosenwald schools and libraries built by black communities during the deepest, darkest days of Jim Crow, closely tied to HBCUs. Actually, last night after his speech, Freeman told me, I was telling him about, asking him what he knew about the Rosenwald schools. He said, my family all went to Rosenwald schools. That's where they got their passion and their vision and their formation. Well, they weren't the only ones. Coretta Scott King, John Lewis, Maya Angelou, Medgar Evers, and thousands of local leaders went to the Rosenwald schools. They were the very foundation of the civil rights movement, and it is a disgrace that that is not taught in schools. Has any of you had a class on the Rosenwald schools as the precursors and the foundation of the civil rights movement? They came out of a fund at Tuskegee that Booker T. Washington had created with Julius Rosenwald, who was head of Sears Roebuck, one of the world's richest men, but also a guy committed to social justice and to black advance, supporters of black YMCAs, for example. But Washington got Rosenwald to create this fund so black communities could apply to the fund for 1/3 the cost of building a school. And these schools became what can be called community commons, gathering places, sites. They were places of tremendous pride because people built the schools. They were places of power, of agency, of leadership development. That's why so many of the movement's leaders came out of the Rosenwald schools. And they were a key feature of them, and all of you students who think about being teachers or other professions should think about this, were a network of teachers called Gene's teachers. They had their own funding. Network of supervising teachers who often supervised other black teachers across the South who organized communities to build these schools. And not only to build the schools, but also to keep them going, to wrangle money from the white power structure, to build alliances with, these stories of alliances are just not known. But actually the Gene's teachers and the Rosenwald schools and libraries had many connections with poor whites in the rural areas because there weren't any libraries. They were the libraries, and they opened them across racial lines. They developed alliances with white professionals who thought it was a disgrace that black education was in such poor condition. And then as I've studied the Gene's teachers, I've come to realize this is really important, and this is one reason why they're so instructive. They developed the practices of nonviolence. They didn't necessarily call them that, but some have because they were all schooled in HBCUs, and that meant that they were familiar with works like Howard Thurman, who was the great philosopher of nonviolence in the African-American tradition at Howard, and before that Morehouse. But they developed all of the practices that King codified in Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, which of course became a world-famous bestseller. The Gene's teachers practiced them to create these schools and libraries going. Well, what does this history have to do with the Civic Learning Symposium? Everything. Everything. Today I'm calling for the higher education movement to take leadership in revitalizing and promoting the commonwealth, which involves commons like the Rosenwald schools and libraries, and other things too. Commonwealth means government of the people, by the people, for the people, but also much more. It is a way, and it has been a way, and it's a powerful way of talking about the whole ecology of higher education. students, staff, teachers, community partners, and also buildings, facilities, fields, museums. It's also a way of talking about the larger public world, which is now endangered in America. Galbraith wrote a book in '58 called talking about the squalor of the public realm. Well, that's become worse. So let me just ask you to think yourselves for a minute about some common resource in your community that you appreciate, that you feel is important, that you take pride in or pleasure in. And just think for a minute and talk about that with a neighbor. And after the speech, if we have a time, you can bring it back. I don't have time to have the conversation now, but just talk for a minute to a neighbor about some common resource, some common thing, that where people gather, where people can socialize, where people can develop relationships. Okay, I think we're going to have to get back together. I hope you had some ideas, and I hope we can talk about them some more. This is our challenge. We face a dramatic destruction of the common world, the public world. I want to give two examples: higher education and public institutions like elections and government agencies. In both cases, we see an erosion of the commons. And I think we can trace both to the fact that we've increasingly used a consumer market model for public things, including government and including higher education. Ball State's mission, I should say, points beyond this problem. This is a quote, "We engage students in educational research and in creative endeavors that empower our graduates to have fulfilling careers enriched by lifelong learning and service. We enhance the economic, environmental, and social vitality of our community, our state, and our world." Those are kind of commonwealth themes. How well they do it is another question, but they're important as a vision statement. I would also say the Civic Learning Symposium and all of the things I've heard, from student presentations to things like the Community Engaged Alliance, other initiatives, the League of Women Voters, Create, they're all examples that can point towards a commonwealth consciousness. So there are a lot of things to build on, but for all of the accomplishments, I don't think we can be naive about the dangers. So first I'm going to start about the dangers to the common world. Then I'm going to talk about the history of the Commonwealth and its multiple meanings. It doesn't mean simply common good, which is a religious term. It doesn't mean simply government. It means a lot of different things, very richly tied to the history of the democratic mission and practice in higher education. I'm going to give some theoretical resources that are now developing and have been developing through the field of civic studies that Trig mentioned. And I'm going to give, finally, 3 short examples of Commonwealth initiatives, all of which are important. The Harvard philosopher Michael Sandel, in his recent book, The Tyranny of Merit, elaborates the danger to the public good in higher education. Now, he also is appreciative of all the things that Ivy League schools and others can contribute, the great scholarship, the brilliant teaching. But he says for all of that, higher education and has come to be a hierarchy. It's come to be a meritocracy. So in my judgment, one of the things that really is visible out of that is the invisibility of historically black colleges and universities, which, as John Wilson, the recent president of Morehouse, says, have led the country in citizen education. Now, what is more important than preparing citizens? But Sandel puts it, education has turned into a sorting mechanism. You can see it in the way we start from kindergarten on, sorting the winners from the losers, smart kids from the dumb kids, people who are good at taking tests from those who aren't good at taking tests. And this correlates strongly with partisan politics. As Sandel describes in 2016, the Democratic Party once stood for farmers and working people against the privileged. Now, in the meritocratic age, its defeated standard bearer, I'm not going to make some people mad about this, but this is Sandel. Its defeated standard bearer, that was Hillary Clinton, boasted that she got support from the prosperous and enlightened parts of the country, and the backward and ignorant parts of the country were against her. Remember the basket of deplorables. Well, recent polling from a joint project of Gallup and Lumina show the result. Confidence, public confidence, has dropped among all key subgroups in the U.S. over the past 2 decades towards higher education, most among Republicans. Confidence in higher education among Republicans today is nearly a mirror image of what it was 9 years ago. In 2015, 50% of Republicans had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in higher education. 11% had little or none. Now, 20% express confidence in higher education. 50% have little or no confidence in higher education. So that creates a problem, right? But the collapse of support for higher education is also just one piece of the pie. Polling shows that similar patterns are true for government and also for local institutions, like public schools and religious congregations and everything basically except small businesses, which continue to be popular. In government, the notion of government as us, of the people, by the people, for the people, our instrument, as the preamble puts it, has changed to government as a service provider. Democracy is something that delivers. Started in the Clinton administration, 1992, which adopted the idea of reinventing government so that citizens were customers and government could sufficiently deliver services, spread across all the agencies. And it's been more and more. A former local manager, Frank Benest, has written a very, very insightful piece called Engaging Citizens or Serving Customers, which describes what happens. He says, government is now like a vending machine. We put stuff in our case, taxes and votes, and we get stuff out. As Bennis puts it, the vending machine model undermines people's confidence in and their allegiance to government. If customers don't like what they get, they can kick the machine or vote for somebody else to run it. But it doesn't ask what people can give, what people can contribute. This rests on a diminished view of citizens. It's a degrading view of citizens to say citizens are customers. I mean, they are partly want to know what they can get, but they have so many more talents and capacities than that notion. It's also it's a deficit model. It looks at what's wrong with people that government can fix, and he gives good examples. You know, a good illustration of this, pay attention to the election language this year. The theme of citizenship has almost entirely disappeared from political discourse. In the 2000 election, George Bush campaigned on a call for civic values and citizenship. In his convention speech, he argued, Who we are is more important than what we have. After the election, Bush said in his inaugural address, I want you to be citizens. I ask you to be citizens, not spectators, to serve your nation beginning with your neighborhood. Barack Obama took this to another level in 2008 in his 2000 campaign, which I was involved with. His message of citizenship pervaded every speech. Announcing his campaign in 2007, he said, this campaign has to be about recovering the meaning of citizenship, redoing our sense of common purpose. Throughout the campaign, he talked about his campaign as simply the beginning of a process of citizen empowerment. I want you to believe in your capacity to make change, not my capacity, as was on his website. He said, the fact is, and this is an honest statement, but how many politicians say this these days? He said, the fact is, the challenges we face today are simply too big for government to solve alone. We need all hands on deck. Of course it's true. If we think about it, we know it's true. The problems are too complex and too large for government to solve, but nobody sounds like that. After being involved in the campaign, it makes me really mad to see the Democratic standard bearer, as dynamic and charismatic as Kamala Harris is, to not talk about citizens. She talks about what she can do. And the Democratic convention this summer, speaker after speaker said, they changed the language of the 2008 campaign from yes, we can. Anybody know what it changed to? Yes, she can. Yes, she can. And Obama, who had talked about we need all hands on deck, and this is about empowering, in his speech to the Democratic convention said, yes, she can. And also, democracy is something we have to prove that delivers the goods to people. That's the consumer mindset. It's not about the people themselves being democracy. Of course, this generates distance. This generates a sense that government is not us, it's out there, distant. Today, 35% of Democrats and Democratic leading independents said that they trust government, compared with 11% of Republicans and Republican leaders. And as I said, Gallup shows polling confidence has dropped towards schools, religious congregations, local news, and others. A majority express confidence only in the military and in small businesses. So let me just ask another question and just think about this for a minute to yourselves. How vivid is the idea of commons or commonwealth? Is it something you've thought about? Is it something that ever occurs or you ever talk about? Or is it a new idea before today? Exchange comments with your neighbor if you. Okay, well, let's get back together, but keep in mind what you think, and I hope we have time to talk about it at the end. Let me give a brief history of the meaning of commonwealth. One idea was that what means government by the people, for the people, of the people, government that is elected, not a monarchy. That has old roots. In fact, it appears in the Bible, the Commonwealth of Jerusalem. But most specifically, the idea of commonwealth rather than monarchy came out of the 17th century civil war in England, when parliamentary forces overthrew the king and for a time created a commonwealth. So when the colonists were fighting for independence from Great Britain, the idea of commonwealth had a lot of resonance as a popular government, not a monarchy. John Adams proposed every state be called a commonwealth, and 4 states were commonwealths. Do you know what they were? Who knows what the commonwealth states are, the official? Yeah, Trig, I know you do, but back there in the back. Speak up.
Michigan.
No.
Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Virginia.
Yes.
Massachusetts.
What? Kentucky, yes. And Massachusetts, yes. Good. But in the U.S., commonwealth meant many other things. Drawing on Catholic social thought and the Native American view of the world, it had meant that property is not private simply, to be kept apart from everything. It has a social dimension. It has impact. This idea led to a whole legal theory that we talked about last night called the Commonwealth jurisprudence. So you could judge whether things needed to be regulated by what kind of public impact they had. Railroads were obviously a case. Now, commonwealth is also like the term common good. There's a lot of similarity. But it actually had a difference. It was concrete. It was materialized. It was embodied. Concrete commons were things that communities created. In fact, for many immigrants, America was a chance to recreate commons that had been destroyed or privatized by elites in Europe. The labors of settlers who cleared lands, built villages, schools, libraries, meeting halls, roads, local government, congregations, local government itself, generated what the historian Robert Wiebe has called a portable democracy, that is, democracy that's in the process of construction. Citizen labors that produced commons created the language of we the people in the constitutional preamble. As the historians Oscar and Mary Hanlon observed in their book Commonwealth, for the farmers and seamen, for the fishermen, artisans, and new merchants, Commonwealth meant the lessons they knew from the organization of churches and towns, the value of common action. It was the people making things of common use. In the 19th century, now actually this history is pretty well known. The history in African American and other communities is not as well known, but as the Rosenwald story shows, it was even probably more extensive. But historians like David Matthews, a historian of public schools, said 19th century self-rule was a sweaty, hands-on, problem-solving politics. It was rooted in collective decision-making and acting, especially acting. Settlers on the frontier had to be producers, not simply consumers. They joined forces to build forts, roads, and libraries. They formed associations to combat alcoholism, care for the poor. They established the first public schools, which were called common schools. Their efforts were an example of public work, that is, work by the public, not simply for the public. In Minnesota, and by the way, it's also similar in Indiana. I was talking to someone from the Indiana Historical Society. There's a wonderful document on the site of the Historical Society that shows, called The Commonwealth of Indiana. It's a lecture that was given to women's clubs in 1928, but it shows all of the commons that were created in Indiana. In Minnesota, the Commonwealth continued as a major public idea through the 20th century. And this is an important thing. Commonwealth, although it had an insurgent, populist, democratic element, also crossed economic lines. The Cooperative Commonwealth, for example, was a program of the Farmer Labor Party, which came out of populist farmers' movements and African-American freedom struggles and cooperatives and labor organizing. It also meant, this is a topic we don't have time to go into today, but it's extraordinarily important. It also suggested a different political economy than either state-centered socialism or unbridled capitalism. The platform of the Cooperative Commonwealth stressed the importance, the foundational role of small business and cooperatives and family farms. They were the foundation of a democratic society. There's a whole interesting and largely unknown literature about this, but it's very important because it shows that rather than what was wrong with America, that we didn't have a big socialist movement, there was something else instead. There was a movement based on small property that had a civic dimension. Commonwealth was also a term used by many civic and business leaders. Minnesota's early settlers came from New England Yankee backgrounds. Idea of civic stewardship of the Commonwealth was central to what they understood leadership to mean. As Bertha Halbum of the Minnesota Historical Society said in the 75th issue of St. Paul Pioneer Press, commemorating statehood, those who grew up in Minnesota during the period after the Civil War saw Minnesota emerge from a frontier state into a commonwealth. Leading citizens helped to build libraries and schools and colleges and universities, orchestras, art galleries, and theaters that complemented the growth of the economy. Until the 1960s, the norm among businesses was to give back 5% of their profit for civic improvement. 5%. It was called the 5% rule. Every business was expected to give 5% of their profit back to the civic life of the Twin Cities. Embodying all of these meanings, Lotus Kaufman, the University of Minnesota president from 1920 to 1938, entitled his inaugural address, "The University and the Commonwealth." Now, Kaufman was a leader in a larger movement. Land-grant colleges, schools like Ball State, state regional colleges, HBCUs, religiously founded local institutions, colleges, all had a kind of vision of developing the capacities of ordinary citizens from every walk of life to contribute. Alfred Arnold, an extension leader in the University of North Dakota in the teens, founded the Little Country Theater movement. It seated theaters, local theaters, in hundreds of towns across the Midwest. And this was the rationale. There were literally millions of people in country communities today whose abilities along various lines have been hidden simply because they have never had the opportunity to give expression to their talents. This lack of self-expression has been in many ways due to the narrow-minded attitudes of a society towards those who till the soil and work in factories, and the absence of forces which arouse the creative instincts and stimulate the imagination and initiative of country people. Arousing the instincts, stimulating the passions, developing the talents, was the mission of this whole tier of institutions, which were democracy schools. Scott Peters, an historian of this tradition, found that that was a very common term that later became part of the language of community colleges too. Democracy schools. Democracy schools meant awakening the talent and the capacity of individuals, but also for civic contribution. So it was that combination that Rabowski and I talked about last night. Liberty Hat Bailey, dean of the College of Agriculture at Cornell, and the founder of the extension tradition. He was chair of the Country Life Commission, which developed the vision for cooperative extension, argued that every aspect of higher education should be infused with the Commonwealth spirit. Bailey was one of the world's leading scientists, horticulturalists, and developed many specialties at Cornell. But this is important. and this is what Rubowski was saying about what they hope for from UMBC graduates. Every kind of professional work, no matter how brilliant, could actually damage a democracy if it was seen as a substitute for the energies and the capacities of ordinary citizens. So as he put it, every scientist should see themselves as part of a great public work grounded in respect for the talents of rural communities. The farmer, he argued in 1904, is a citizen, a member of the commonwealth. He saw the most important focus of university extension as increasing citizen capacities to work across differences, to work on community problems. So that's a brief history of a very rich story that needs to be much better known. But I want to say there are new resources to think about this. And I want to highlight two, especially from the field of civic studies, which Craig mentioned. Civic studies is a transdisciplinary field. It means it's not only disciplines in universities, but also transdisciplinary. It's knowledge from outside of universities and colleges as well, community knowledge and the craft and spiritual and local and experiential knowledge. It aims partly at challenging the notion that those in higher education, especially professors, the professoriate, are outside observers. It puts everyone in the position of citizens, responsible for the consequences of our action. This is the language of another co-founder, Peter Levine. Let me highlight two other resources. One is the work of Eleanor Ostrom, down the road in Bloomington. She's died a few years ago, 2013, but she was a co-founder of Civic Studies. So Ostrom and her colleagues around the world looked at the conventional wisdom in academia up to the 1990s, which was that the commons, these common resources, were destined to extinction. Very famous article by an environmentalist called Garrett Hardin, who called The Tragedy of the Commons, said that they were going to be taken over by government or they were going to be marketized. They were gone. Community resources were gone. Well, they looked at cases to see if that were true. And they found only in specialized conditions would that be true, but actually there were ways that commons could be sustained and enhanced. And you know what that involved? For the people, for the citizens of communities to have primary role in governance, creating the rules and the regulations and the sanctions if people violated the commons. She showed that actually they can be sustained and enhanced if you have strong people's involvement in the commons. Her famous book was called Governing the Commons. In 2007, Ostrom and Peter Levine and several others and I started Civic Studies. And part of it was to challenge the fatalism that was widespread in academia about things like the Commonwealth. And it was an occasion to talk about an idea that I'd worked on with colleagues all around the world of what we call public work. Public work is the idea that, as Trigg said, a democracy is not simply a set of institutions or a set of distant elections. Democracy is best thought of as the everyday work of people who work together to create common things and solve common problems, the Commonwealth. So Civic Studies offers resources we can look at and use and think about. I want to conclude by talking about some examples today. First of all, one of the great challenges we face is that the polarization and the divisions in the country are just ripping apart the sense of common citizenship, upon which any commonwealth depends. And there are efforts, like the Braver Angels group, to overcome that toxic polarization. Braver Angels was founded right after the election in 2016, has developed all sorts of workshops and methods of debate and discussion that allow people to get over their own stereotypes and understand other people in terms of their stories and their histories, not in terms of simply what's in their heads. And there's a youth partner of, a student partner of Brave Angels I want to mention called Bridge USA that has 63 affiliates, which aims at getting beyond the kind of activist student us versus them mindset, the wars that we see around free speech and other issues, the Gaza war and so forth. That doesn't mean that you agree, it doesn't mean you give up your opinions, but you learn to understand where other people are coming from. I want to focus on 3 examples. First is the Rosenwald story is coming back. Coming back in the fact that out of those communities that built schools, 500 of them are rebuilding, reconstructing the schools as community centers, as history centers, cultural centers. But there's also an alliance in Texas of all the historically black colleges and universities called the Democracy School Alliances, which claims this history, both in the HBCUs and in the Rosenwald tradition. It says democracy is not simply elections, democracy is actually building the life of our communities. Students who were mentored by Robert Seressa, political scientists at Houston Tillotson in Austin, have played really important roles. It was a student's idea that all of the HBCUs should come together. And they've been working with a community organization called the Industrial Areas Foundation, which teaches the skills of working across partisan divides. And remarkably, the students across Texas have pushed the legislature in Texas to create the first ever historically black college and university caucus. And part of it, the point, is to make this history known. And the library system in Austin is officially now undertaking a partnership to make all sorts of stories from the Rosenwald schools and the Jeans teachers known. It was a big movement in Texas. And so the language of the democracy schools is that democracy is us. It's not them. We all do democracy. It's not something we hire people to do for us. The second initiative, I'm very delighted to be at Ball State University. Ball State University has been a leader in the course called Third Way Civics, which was the topic of a session before this. I'm also pleased you have a number of the recent book that I co-authored with several colleagues, Awakening Democracy. Awakening Democracy for students, I want to talk to the students before you leave just a second, has stories of young people your age and younger who've made differences all around the world, who've shown what they can do against the expectations of adults in many cases. It's also full of stories of teachers who've made a difference and schools which have made a difference. But the Ball State is the site of Third Way Civics. Has anybody been in a Third Way Civics course here? So Third Way Civics, yeah, you have. Third Way Civics? Okay. Third Way Civics is a history or civics course, it can be adapted to other disciplines, which immerses citizens in a reflective and collaborative experience that does not provide answers. Doesn't provide answers to major public questions, but builds their capacities to pose their own questions, formulate their own answers, and to act on them. Students learn to contend with the fact that there is no one story in America. There are many stories in America. There's a plurality of stories. And to be a citizen, we have to learn that reality and to negotiate that plurality. And doing so and being co-creators of their own learning, and the teachers in Third Way Civics don't tell you the answer. They don't tell you what to think. They don't tell you what the right ideology is. They say there are all these different points of view. Engage them, read them, using primary sources. Read from the revolutionary period, the critics of the revolution for not including African Americans or freeing the slaves. Mercy Warren, the feminists, Native people who are saying, well, you're using our own, history in the Iroquois Confederation, and you're not really recognizing our, as well as Adams and Jefferson and Madison. So all sorts of voices, and that's true throughout the course. looking at many different voices, and then asking students, challenging students to work with those, come up with proposals and solutions and projects. And it's a very creative course. I interviewed a young woman, African-American student at Mankato, Landis Parham, about her experience. She said the class worked for her because it began with relationships and stories, not with what people thought. It's the same way as actually Braver Angels does. She learned the importance of hearing different points of view. And then she said this, which was really quite profound, I thought. She said, the opportunity to think about all these different points of view and voices means that we have to be co-creators. We have to be writing our own history of America. There's no text that we can accept. We can be given, saying this is the American story. There are many stories. And she loved that, by the way. David Roof has been doing evaluations of the many institutions which have been doing Third Way Civics and found that they have very strong positive civic impacts on student motivation, on their knowledge, on their interest in being involved, on their hope that change can come. It's a really pioneering course I want to call attention to. The third initiative, I call it shared stewardship of the Commonwealth. This comes out of the health field. In recent years, health has shifted from a model, or the thinkers and architects of health policy have begun to shift from what can we deliver to the people seen as consumers of health to how can communities build their own resilience and capacities to be healthy communities. And that creates something called a framework called vital conditions. What are the vital conditions of a healthy community like? Good jobs, housing, decent food, but also what they call belonging, a sense of community, and civic muscle, which is basically a sense of empowerment. So in 2020, the Centers for Disease Control commissioned Bobby Milstein, who's been a real leader in this, used to be the director of evaluation for the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, to create a coalition of groups outside of government to develop a plan for what government could do to be resources for communities in building healthy communities. 100 groups were involved. Trig and I and Mari were involved in it. And they came out with a program called Thriving Together Springboard. The report highlights belonging and civic muscle as centrally important to community well-being. It argues that stewards and the Thriving Together movement go beyond the service marketplace where we're delivering services to the idea of building healthy communities, expanding the belonging and civic muscle we need to shape a more vibrant and thriving commonwealth. Now, interestingly, dozens of federal agencies in the health and well-being field have come together to think about how to implement this, how to change their mindset, how to change their approach. As Rachel Levine, the Assistant Secretary for Health, put it in her keynote address last year to the American Public Health Association, this is changing the way we're thinking. The Vital Conditions Framework identifies core elements needed to create a thriving community, rather than looking at communities in terms of what they lack and their deficiencies. It asks us to make a philosophical shift in the whole framework. Now that is actually beginning to think about how government can be not only for the people, but of the people and by the people again. It's a very pioneering thing. I think it's a kind of disgrace that these dozens of agencies, which are really trying to rethink what it means to do government work, have been completely invisible in the election. Why aren't we talking about that? I mean, Grabowski last night talked about why aren't we talking about education? Well, the other thing is why aren't we talking about what it means to create healthy communities? Beyond government, the Thriving Together movement is gaining substantial traction across the country. At the heart of the movement are ideas of stewards and shared stewardship based on mutual responsibility and care for the whole. Stewardship is a systems approach. It's like Commonwealth. It goes beyond simply issue work or particular project or particular group and looks for how we make connections across many different domains to advance the welfare of the whole. It's been paired with the Vital Conditions Framework Its vision is to grow a well-being economy with incentives for businesses and others for just purpose and profit that focus on the value of expanding the conditions to unlock everyone's potential. This is very pioneering. Oh yeah, I got another minute. Thanks, Drew. So shared stewardship overlaps with stories from the students at UMBC, the Texas HBCUs, students in the Third Way Civics course, developing capacities to make change. Let me say that for more on this, chapter 10 in Grabowski's book, The Empowered University, tells what they've been doing at UMBC around this and how they're spreading it to professional identities. And in my book, Awakening Democracy Through Public Work, we have many chapters on the work that young people have done, but we also talk about what is being done in places like UMBC and higher education, and also what citizens can do when they give up the idea of controlling and become catalysts and partners with people, when they become on tap, not on top. So I want to just end with a challenge. I think higher education can take enormous leadership if it takes up this history of the commons and the commonwealth. And I look forward to seeing how your work unfolds. Thank you.
Harry, thank you so much. We have complimentary copies of Harry's book in the back, Awakening Democracy Through Public Work, with contributions by his wife, Mari. I highly, please take some. It's less for me to carry home, but it's a remarkable book on preparing young people for citizenship, in their future roles in life, professionally and personally. So we have an amazing set of final presentations. Getting started, again, the Challenging Conversations, Mythologies, and Critical Examination session has been moved to 3:05. But remarkable set of final presentations. So please join us. You will learn a tremendous amount and engage with people from our community. And I think Harry will be around if you want a signature for your book.